move, Charlie. Stay
Okay,
there.
all right. Will do.
Well, welcome everybody. We're trying something a little bit different. We've gone definitely 21st century. Besides the wireless microphones, which maybe are more like 1999, we're using the iPad and running this pretty much wirelessly through here. So I've had my fingers crossed all morning. Seems to all be hooked up and ready to go. So welcome aboard. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rich Tabor. I'm here with my beautiful wife, Susan, who's a member and who's brought me along as an associate member. A few months ago, I was invited by Bud and Kathy Potter to meet at their home with my fellow presenter, Daniel Rodericks. The purpose of the get-together was to view several video clips that Dan had brought along, and he had collected them as part of his family's ongoing research into the life history of their grandfather, Captain John Theophilo Gonsalves. You see pictured here. What developed out of that meeting was an opportunity to produce this presentation. It's a program on the life of Captain Gonsalves, and it was purposely created for the descendants of Whirling Masters and presented here at the organization's annual meeting. Since Dan is clearly the authority on the subject of his grandfather, I'm going to take the role of a somewhat informed journalist in what will be a question and answer format with this accompanying slide presentation. So let's get right into it. Okay. Your grandfather, he was born in Cape Verde on the Isle of Brava on December 16th, 1858. Brava on that small map there is in the far bottom left side of the map of Cape Verde, which is approximately, what, 400 or 500 miles off the northwest coast of Africa. He spent nearly his entire life going to sea, mostly on vessels out of New Bedford Harbor, on which he sailed as master on many, and died in his 70th year in March 1928. How well did you know your grandfather growing up?
I never did, because he died, I was 3 months old. I just hear of him, so.
But he did have a nickname that...
Yeah, my mother used to say that they called him Theophilus Pep. That's Theophilus of Pep.
Okay, and that referenced his father.
That referenced his father, that's
Okay.
his father.
So that's the name you had always heard, so...
Yeah, so we was brought up here in Theophilus Pep, he was a captain, and all the other stories that went with it, so, but we never did know him, so.
So it came as a surprise when you, through your research, discovered that his name was actually John, his first
Yeah,
name.
my brother Jack had started all the information, and when my brother worked, was 25 years, he retired from the Air Force into Florida. And after the 25 years, he went to work for the Space Center. And during the time at the Space Center, they were dropping spaceships into the Atlantic Ocean. But then they decided to drop it in the Pacific Ocean.
A whole different thing.
A whole different thing. And so he was on the committee there in Florida. They decided to get information from the New Bedford Whaler Museum.
Because the vastness of the ocean?
Because they didn't have the ocean all documented. They said the whalers had it all documented in the Pacific.
The tiny islands and a lot of things that weren't charted.
And they were dropping the astronauts in there. So.
It's kind of interesting how, from the serendipity of your brother being involved in the space program engineering in the 1960s to today, you've developed a comprehensive accounting of your grandfather's voyages and adventures. When did your grandfather start his maritime career and on what boat?
My grandfather started at the age of 11, and he started his career on the bark Roman, which he spent 3 years on it. So
Okay, and that's a model of the Bach Roman. So you can see three-masted, a lot smaller than some of the larger whaleboats. But, you know, it's kind of interesting that you said he was 11 years old, born in 1858. If you add that up, that's 1869. And by my calculation, putting him on the Roman at that time, that was the trip in which the Roman got trapped and crushed in the ice in the Franklin Point in the Seahorse Islands, along with 32 other whale ships. And the crew all escaped over ice. Did anyone in your family ever talk about this?
No, at that time, we didn't know all of that. So we heard that he had been escaped. We read on different things doing our research that he had escaped the Arctic and the ice storms and all that.
But there was a
Well,
gap then in the...
I couldn't find much detail on it, so.
Right. Well, I mean, if you can see on the slide here, that what we're saying is that the ship, the Bach Roman, was lost in 1871, and it was on a 3-year voyage. So that would mean that that was the boat that, the trip that he was on.
Yeah, he was.
It's amazing. I mean, that was referred to as the whaling disaster of 1871. You know, the industry, which is already beginning to suffer because of the switch over to petroleum, now lost a good portion of their whale fleet. The 32 boats that were lost, they weren't all out of New Bedford, but most of them were. I mean, the majority of them were. There were some from New London, there was one from Hawaii, but the vast majority of those 32 boats that were lost in the ice, crushed in the ice, were from the New Bedford fleet.
Well, I have some information here that I had on that particular time when it was in the Arctic, and I'll read it. So it's so interesting, and it says here about many of the almost unbelievable tales told of hardships experienced by the Arctic whalers. This is an instance in which the crew of one vessel encountered another in the ice fields. They were amazed to see that no helmsman stood at the wheel of the listless vessel. A hail brought no response. A boat crew set out to investigate, found that the master of the ship, his wife, and the whole crew was frozen stiff and stark, several of them apparently while engaging in customary tasks. He says, in 1871, a fleet of 32 vessels entered the Arctic for a summer of fishing. Most of them were from New Bedford. Although the Eskimos warned them of early winter, a plentiful supply of whales caused the masters to tarry and take their time. There was a shift in the wind. The ice bands started their relentless grinding, and only one of the vessels escaped. 31 were either frozen in or crushed, lost forever in the Arctic waste. Their officers and crews, including the wives and children of some of the captains, 1,206 souls in all, took to the whaleboats. They made a journey of 80 miles through the Arctic gale and were taken aboard 7 more fortunate vessels that were free of the grinding ice and reached Honolulu without loss of a single life.
That's amazing. That's miraculous.
It says here, 22 of the lost whale ships belonged to New Bedford, and with their outfits and cargoes were valued at $1.5 million. In 1876, the city sustained another severe loss when 12 vessels had to be abandoned in the ice. The Roman was trapped in ice and was crushed. The crew escaped on the port side on whaleboats by dragging them through ice into the water. The Roman had 640 barrels of whale oil on her below deck when she was crushed.
Yeah, just a remarkable tale. Just to further prove what many of us already know about how rugged and rough a life on the seas to capture whales was. But this is an indication of some of the research and the extensive research you've done over all these years. Meticulous research, and it's played a key role in learning about the life of your grandfather. So let's just go back a little bit to when your brother started doing the research. Do you recall how your brother first began his research and in what year he did?
I believe he started his research in 1967 when he went to work for the Space Center. And he worked at the Kennedy Space Center on Cape Canaveral, Florida. His voyage, the problem we did it all this, whenever they used to come into New Bedford about once a year, we started to go to different museums and stuff. But when he called, and they called the Whaler Museum when he worked for the Space Center about documentation, and someone at the Whaler Museum he spoke to, and he described what they were looking for at the Space Center. In the meantime, he happened to say that his grandfather was a whaling captain. And they said, who was he? He said, John Gonsalves. And then they came back and said, geez, we have quite a few John Gonsalves, John T. Gonsalves, Theophilus Gonsalves. But we never knew his name was John, we always knew it as Theophilus, so.
So all those references turned out to be.
So that reference turned out, so we started having something to look for. So we had gone to the, whenever he came to New Bedford once a year, we went to the Providence Sound Museum, Kendall Museum in Sharon. He even stopped in Maui, Hawaii, and got information on him. And the Essex Museum, Peabody, we had the libraries in New Bedford.
Well, in 1992, you spoke with Sylvester Sylvia on the television program, The Portuguese Around Us. Let's go to that clip where you describe what you knew then in 1992 about the vessels on which your grandfather sailed.
When I asked Dan to be a guest of The Portuguese Around Us, I had no idea at the time that his family was so enriched in the whaling business, whaling industry. And today this morning we're going to be asking Dan to tell us about his grandfather, who was a fascinating person, and as I understand was the last of the captains of the famous Charles Morgan. So go ahead and run loose here. Tell us about it.
Well, my brother Jack has been doing research for 5 years.
Where does he live?
And he lives in Satellite Beach in Florida.
I see.
And through all his research, we found out that our grandfather had been the last captain of the last whaling voyage of the Morgan voyage number 37. So my grandfather was born in December 18, incidentally, that's my birthday.
Oh, that's
in
great.
1858 in Brava, Cape Verde Islands. And at the age of 11, he left the islands on a whaling ship to New Bedford and started his career in whaling. And he spent 3 years on that, on the bark Roman as a cabin boy. From that 3 years, he went to the Latia for another 3 years as a cook. Then he spent 2 more years on the bark Sea Queen, and he became second mate. And then he gradually went on to be first mate. And he spent 2 years on the schooner Amelia, and then on the the Fanny Bond. And after the Fanny Bond, he ended up spending 2 years on the Rising Sun out of Provincetown, which he became mate. And at the age of 21, he became a captain. And he spent 12 years as a captain on the Rising Sun. Then from there, we had a various list of ships he's been on, which he was the master of the Eunice Adams of Edgartown. the schooner Baltic of Provincetown, the William Grosvenor, the Bach Bertha, the schooner Golden City, the E.B. Cornwell, the William Grabber, A.B. Nicholson, the Gazelle, John Dodson, Cape Florence, the Morning Star, and
that list is so impressive because when, if you, as I've talked to you prior to this program, when captain takes out a ship, you've named so many, and they didn't go out for 8 days or 30 days. They went out for months, right?
yeah, months, years. Well, the average captain, so my understanding, had 3 to 5 ships during their career, but he spent 50 years at sea, and this list of ships went on to around 29 to my count. Best week, as our knowledge from different newspapers and the museums and everything else we've collected, so that way there. And his last, he went on the Reindeer, the Amelia, Irving Azevedo, the Eunice Adams, the T. Towner, and the Charles W. Morgan. His last ship was on the schooner W.B. Graver, which he retired from that in 1922. Now, in 1921, he had the honor of being the captain on the Charles W. Morgan Voyage 37. And he was picked because Captain Edwards, which was taking the boat out, got ill. And so they called on my grandfather to take that ship out. So the Morgan departed New Bedford in September 1920 and returned in May 1921. This was a short trip for him, about a year. But he returned with 2,702 barrels of oil.
My God.
With the price down at that particular time, the oil had been 73 cents a gallon, and it dropped down to 30. So the total value, the value of the cargo was only $25,533.
Should have been around 50, right?
Should have been way up.
But that's when a dollar was a dollar.
Yeah, at that time. But if you look back and you see all the money that was taken in that era,
It's amazing.
millions. Considering what the wage, how long they worked, the average trip was 1.5 to 3 years, and sometimes the seamen on there would only receive like $300, $400 for the whole trip.
My gosh.
So that was 1992, but research, of course, is ongoing, and as of late 2018, this was the updated list, which Dan can tell us a little bit about. The ones in red are the ones in which John Zioflo Garshouse served as master. So this list now encompasses 32 boats, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, the last report I got from the Whaling Museum was that he had 32 whaling voyages, and he had 20 voyages as master.
32 voyages and 20 as master.
Yeah, 20 as master.
That's
And
amazing.
also he had 3 voyages that he was captain of packet ships and clipper ships back and forth to Cape Verde. So,
Well, what does it mean that your grandfather was the last master of the Charles W. Morgan?
well, it means so much to me and the family that our heritage was a good part of America that we never knew about. And so we feel very proud that we at least got information as to it's such a fascinating life and a hard life.
It is quite an amazing thing. And then the Charles Morgan is the last whaling vessel, wooden whaling vessel. An amazing, lucky life.
It's a National Historic Monument now, so.
And it's been restored and as most of you know, and is moored in Mystic. We've got this other video clip I'd like to go to. It was just a few months before the previous one. It was in 1991, I believe in the summer of 1991. It's a video clip that was celebrating actually two different things. One was the 150th anniversary of the launch of the original launch of the Morgan, but also the 50th anniversary of it going to Mystic. So let's take a look at that video clip as well.
Many of these people remember when the Charles W. Morgan was grounded in New Bedford. In 1941, she was just another dilapidated wooden ship littering the shoreline. New Bedford could not afford to restore the Morgan, so historians at Mystic, Connecticut adopted her. The Morgan has had some rocky times in Mystic Seaport. She arrived in Connecticut only 1 month before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Historians say it was difficult restoring a century-old whale ship while our country was involved in a war. This Saturday was perhaps one of the Morgan's proudest days. Mystic Seaport held a celebration to mark the Morgan's 50 years in Connecticut. Daniel Rodriguez is the grandson of Captain John Gonsalves, Morgan's last skipper.
Such a wonderful feeling getting on the ship, but it does give you chills, you know, to say that he spent 50 years as a captain on the whaling ships, and he really loved the sea, and so I've laid in his bed downstairs in the ship, and really gives you a feeling to see how rugged the life was and all the hardships they went through, and still he enjoyed the sea so much.
Dan has advised me that I should pronounce his name Rodriguez, which is more accurate. I suppose it's been pronounced a lot of different ways.
Yeah, they call it Rogers, Rodriguez, Roderick. Everything, no matter how it's spelled, R-O-D-R-I-G-U-E-S, is pronounced Rodriguez in Portuguese.
Well, you know, considering the adventures and the time in which your grandfather spent at sea, it would be nearly impossible to spend most of one's life and not have a few remarkable adventures. We've already heard of your grandfather's harrowing experience over the Arctic ice as a boy, escaping with his life. What about hurricanes?
Yeah.
Were there memorable ones that you
Yes,
got?
and hurricanes, information I've got, he was on 3 smashing hurricanes. In October 1904, on the E.V. Conwell with a crew of 23 men. He had left Fayal, Azores, on a return trip to New Bedford. They were only out a day at sea when a storm started. Captain Gonsalves was ready for the storm, with all sails stowed and boats secured. The storm gradually grew worse until it had the little vessel in its power. The hurricane came on board with her with an awful roar of wind and floods of water. The Conwell shipped at sea and put her decks and bulwarks out of sight. And when she rose to it, all her boats had disappeared, as well as everything else that had been loose in any way loose on account. On account of his loss, the captain put in the West Indies port for re-equipment. His second experience was in the rising sun off Cape Hatteras, when boats and deck gear disappeared. Later, in the same vessel and off the same point, he met with a similar gale.
Wow. This is an entry from the logbook of 1904 from the schooner E.V. Conwell, and that's actually the actual handwriting of John Theophilo Gonsalves. A lot of the logbook entries, of course, are very quick. They talk about, you know, where they're sailing and into what winds. This one reads, Journal Logbook, Whaling Schooner E.V. Conwell of New Bedford, Massachusetts, by Captain John Gonsalves, Wednesday, August 17, 1904. Left New Bedford for whaling voyage with 16 of crew for 12 months, cruising with winds from southwest, vessel under all sails, steering south-southeast with easy sea, so end this day. So what about mutiny? I've heard that there's been some talk about a mutiny that happened on board.
Yeah, he had mutiny on the E.V. Conwell in 1905. 2 seamen refused to furl sail when the second mate attempted to enforce the command. The mate ran down into the forecastle and one of them reappeared immediately what the captain calls a cutlass, a sword, and followed by fierce threats of killing the captain and the second mate. It was backed up by drawn life. It does not say how the men were overpowered, but it says that Thomas Williams was put in irons and triced up to the rigging for 10 minutes. When you're triced is by handle by your thumbs for 10 minutes, and after that they put him into the brig. And he wasn't long into the brig because they stayed 4 or 5 days later. They had ended up into a port of Wales, and they needed every available man. So he talked
Got
to
some redemption.
him getting out of jail, but he put him in one of the whaleboats.
Well, it was clearly an important part of that trip because according to this newspaper report that I've got up on the screen there, that pull quote from it says 2/3 of a page of logbook was written over to tell the story. But there's more as far as the adventures go. Captain Gonsalves sailed right into the middle of World War I, in perhaps his most memorable encounter with a German U-boat. Can you tell us more?
Yeah. I can read with it. It says, one can only imagine the colorful, exciting, dangerous life of those courageous men who face more than storm at sea and uncharted courses. One documented story puts Captain John T. Gonsalves in the Atlantic, an especially dangerous place to be during the World War I, with a threat from German U-boats. In June of 1918, Captain Gonsalves abruptly brought in the schooner A.M. Nicholson after a frightening experience with one. He related the experience to a reporter. The submarine glided alongside the Nicholson and then shot across my bows. I gave him the American flag and he didn't answer and submerged. I thought he was an American craft, but when he submerged without answering my flag, I grew suspicious. And when he went down, I went to the south, trying to get out of his way. I had not sailed very far when up came the submarine again, and I gave him the American flag again. This time the submarine gave me back the German flag with another flag beneath it and ordered us to heave to at once. He gave us a gun across the bow to emphasize the fact that he wanted us to stop, and we're not long in going into the wind and dropping our boats. We put all our crew, some 25 men, into 2 whaleboats and according to instructions, pulled alongside the submarine. After pulling alongside our vessel for some time, we didn't take time to let the sails down, thinking that we might get shot or torpedoed at any minute. The submarine steamed alongside my boat when her captain sang out, "What is your vessel doing?" And we said, "Catching sperm whales," I replied. "Catching any other fish?" He asked me. I told him we were not. "For God's sake, Captain," I said, "don't sink this vessel. I'm a poor man, and it will ruin me as I'm a big owner in her." With that, the officer, I think he was the mate, laughed and said he would report to the captain. He saluted another officer who proved to be the captain, who hailed me and said, "Don't you know that this is a poor time to buy vessel property when people are at war?" He said, "I bought this craft before the war," he started. So, and then the captain said to him, "Your English isn't that good, your accent. What nationality are you?" And he said, "We're just poor Portuguese seamen." He said, "Portuguese?" And he said, "Oh, I have great respect and admiration for the Portuguese because they discovered most of the world." And then he said, "Get into," he said, "You can, at the meantime," he said, "see if you can catch your boat because the sails are up." And the ship was going off and they noticed another ship and he said, "What's that ship?" He said, "That's an A.M. Swift." He said, "That's a whaleboat too?" He said, "It is." He said, "Well, you tell him to do the same thing and get out of here." And about that time, they were trying to row to go find their ship. they noticed smoke in the horizon, and it looked like a steamship, but they wasn't paying that any mind. They met up with the Swift and they came into New Bedford. By the time they get to New Bedford, they found that a Norwegian steamship had been sunk on the Wednesday before.
The interesting thing about research sometimes too is that you begin to fill in some of the details. That's a great report on what happened at sea. As I did some research for this presentation, I happened upon this from the archives of the Navy Department, and they identified exactly which U-boat it was, and the one that was just up on the screen, the U-151, that's the actual boat that approached his grandfather's boat on the A.M. Nicholson. So if I read quickly through this, it says at 3 p.m., this is the Navy's accounting of it, at 3 p.m. June 5th, 1918, the American schooner Ella Swift sighted the submarine U-151 in latitude 3030 north and longitude 7340 west. Less than an hour later, the American whaler A.M. Nicholson was halted at the same spot. The master of the whaler urged the submarine officers to spare his ship, saying that it would ruin him financially if the vessel was destroyed. After a brief conference, the submarine officers informed him that he might proceed and ordered him away from the vicinity. The same day, the U-151 sank the Norwegian steamer Vinland, 1,143 gross tons in latitude 3632 north, longitude 7358 west. So that's the real value of getting deeper into the research and having you have a report, you have a story, it's been retold, and you get some corroborating evidence as well. And in this case, this is actually on file in the U.S. Navy archives from 1920. They compiled all of the sightings and encounters with German submarines through World War I. So with that, we get to just an explanation of how the research is a voyage of discovery. We're going to conclude with an example of how research into our whaling ancestry not only informs but enlightens and entertains. Many of us may be familiar with a television program called The History Detectives, which run more about 10 years ago. It had a pretty good run on public television. But quite a while, actually, in the beginning of the century, this last century here, DWM's Alvin Manley, may he rest in peace, approached the program's producers with a question about whether New Bedford whale ships and the Charles W. Morgan in particular provided an extension of the Underground Railroad by employing fugitive slaves to keep them from bounty hunters who would return them to slavery. Two of the program's hosts came to Dan and asked if he found any information on this in his research. Tell us a little bit about that, Dan.
Well, they had approached me figuring I had a lot of information on the whales and asked me if there was any slaves on the Morgan, if I had come across that. But I said I hadn't come across that in my experience during the time my grandfather we did all the research from 1869, 70 all the way to the present.
Right. And actually the time in which he was sailing would be more after that, because he started his adventures when he was 11, which was 1869, so it was kind of following that. But I guess they needed to find that out, so they did some research. And New Bedford, of course, at that time was the home to some of the to many abolitionists. This is a clip from it's a little bit of a longer clip from the History Detectives, where they interview Dan at one point, and they speak with DWM's Alvin Manley and come up with a conclusion. Let's take a look at that clip.
The Charles W. Morgan is the only surviving wooden whaling ship in America. It's permanently moored here in Mystic Seaport. But a local sea captain has heard a mysterious tale that links this ship not with the whaling industry, but with escaping slaves. I'm Wes Cowan, and Tukufu Zuberi and I have come to Mystic Seaport to investigate the sea captain's tale.
Oh, she's a fine ship.
The Charles W. Morgan inspired Captain Alvin Manley to go to sea.
My father grandfather and great uncle were all master mariners. They are all whaling masters, and they made more whaling voyages out of New Bedford than any other family. And when I wanted to go to sea, I had it in my blood.
So, Captain Manley.
Yes, sir.
Do you have a question?
Well, I heard rumors that escaped slaves and so forth crewed up in a lot of these whalers during that period. You ever heard anything like that?
Well, I haven't heard this particular rumor,
Yeah.
but most African Americans equate being on a ship as being that thing which brought them to enslavement. And here, the boat would be serving as a purpose of freedom, as part of the Underground Railroad.
True. That'd be wonderful if it happened.
It sounds unlikely, but is it true? Did the Charles W. Morgan act as an extension of the Underground Railroad? The network of secret paths and safe houses that assisted fugitive slaves in their journey to freedom? Let's start with what we know about the ship itself. While Tukufu goes to check out crew lists for the ship, I'm going to do some local research. The library here houses a collection of some of the private records of the ship's owner and namesake, Charles W. Morgan. I'm interested in the ones from 1841 to 1863, the years when escaping slaves may have been on board the ship.
Wow, what a pile of stuff. Bills of sale.
Let's see, who owns this here? Charles W. Morgan of New Bedford, Samuel Rodman, William G. Pope, receipts for insurance. Now, I don't think we're going to find much there. Oh, what's this? The captain's log. Boy, it's just hard to flip through these things. These are all manuscripted letters, not labeled. What is this? Ah, now, this is better. It's Charles W. Morgan's personal diary from 1849. Oh, what's this? I heard a singular account of escape of a slave. He hid himself, packed up in a box about 3 feet 2 inches long, 2 feet 6 inches wide, 1 feet 11 inches deep, had only a bladder of water with him, and kept himself alive by bathing his face. Oh, God, it looks like he rode upside down for 18 miles, which almost killed him, but he endured it all and was delivered to his anti-slavery friends. Morgan obviously was very sympathetic to this guy. What a great story. It's unbelievable. The fact that Charles W. Morgan was an abolitionist, a member of the anti-slavery movement, doesn't prove anything. But it is strong circumstantial evidence. And it makes Captain Manley's story about escaping slaves on board the Morgan look more likely.
I need hard evidence that fugitive slaves were on board the Charles W. Morgan. The first place to look is the crew list. Most ships' records from this time documented the name and skin color of each man on board for identification purposes. So I'm checking crew lists for the Charles W. Morgan from 1841 to 1863, the year slavery ended.
Here I'm looking at the Wellman's shipping paper, and what you get here is the time of entry, the name of each person, the quality of the individual, basically what it is that they do, and then the witness to the signing. Still no information about the color or racial characteristics of the individuals. The ship made several voyages during this period.
This is interesting. Not all the crew members have signed their names.
These individuals would not have known how to write, so they couldn't have signed their own name. Someone would have had to sign for them. And you have several of them here. This one is Michael Peace, John Riley, James Hamlin.
Most former slaves would have been illiterate, which makes these X marks interesting, but we can't be sure they're escaped slaves because there's no indication of skin color anywhere in these records. We need to get harder evidence if we're to answer Captain Manley's question.
I'm returning to the ship on the hunt for more clues. I'm meeting Daniel Rodricks, whose grandfather, John Gonsalves, was the last captain of the Charles W. Morgan.
This is the room my grandfather spent so many years and hours.
Wow. Boy, can you imagine that?
I can imagine that. What a rugged life they had. So.
How many years do you think he was in that room alone?
Well, in this room alone, I don't know if you count the hours of all the trips in this particular ship. This here is one of the harpoons. It goes right down into the whale.
Gee, can I try this?
Certainly.
So this is basically a fish hook for a whale.
Basically it is.
Daniel, you come from a long line of whaling folks, and you're more than qualified to answer just about any question that anybody might pose to you about whaling. Was the Charles Morgan ever used as a safe haven for escaped slaves or fugitive slaves?
No, I've never come across that information. I haven't heard anything about it. So.
If Daniel, of all people, hasn't heard anything to support Captain Manley's story, that's worrying. What we've got so far is circumstantial at best. We need some hard evidence.
Maybe a whaling voyage lasting anything from 3 to 5 years would offer an even safer haven at sea, possibly on board the Charles W. Morgan itself. But we'll need more evidence to prove that was the case. Of all the names I found on Abolitionist Row, there's one that leaps out. It's Samuel Rodman. Not only was he an abolitionist, he was also Charles W. Morgan's business partner and co-owner of the Morgan. So what kind of man was he? We haven't proved that slaves escaped aboard the Charles W. Morgan ship, but Morgan and Rodman co-owned another ship called the Francis Henrietta. Maybe there'll be some clues in her crew list.
Distinguishing thing about this list is that it has a column for the individual's race. And so I'm reading the list, reading the names on the list, and one just jumps off the page at me. It's John S. Jacobs. John S. Jacobs is the brother, the fugitive brother of Harriet Jacobs, the woman who is the author of what is considered the first autobiography of a slave woman. And in that biography, she mentions that she's searching for John S. Jacobs. Okay, where's John S. Jacobs? John S. Jacobs is on the Francis Henrietta.
This is fundamentally important. We have found an escaped slave working on a whaling ship. If Rodman and Morgan were hiring a fugitive slave to work on the Francis Henrietta, they could definitely do it on the Charles W. Morgan. And if there are crew lists containing racial descriptions for the Francis Henrietta, then there must be some for the Morgan. And I just missed them first time around.
What do you have there? I've got 53 here.
Yeah, I have 49 here.
Yeah, nothing here for 53.
Nothing there for 53.
No, that's it, man. If it's not here, we're done.
This is it. It's the last crew list for the period of enslavement, so it's our final chance.
So this is 1856 to Charles Morgan.
All right.
All right, so what do we have? Well, we have here a black person with woolly hair.
No,
34 years old. David Carrington, but he's from Newburgh, New York.
Slavery was finally abolished in New York in 1841. So we need to find someone who came from one of the pro-slavery southern states.
And then we have Henry Francis from Fishkill, New York. No, he still doesn't look like our man, all right? Okay, what else do we have? Okay, here we go. James Hamlin, North Fork, Virginia, 28 years old, black woolly hair. Look, in the records I looked at earlier, I also came across James Hamlin's name.
Wait a minute, on the Morgan? Same guy?
Yes, same guy, same trip, same ship. The thing about it, though, is he had an X for his name. So now we have some information. He's from the South, from a slave state in 1856.
Yeah.
And he can't read, and he can't write, and he ends up in New Bedford getting ready to get on a whaling ship.
No, wait a minute. Plus, a whaling ship that we know is owned by people that are sympathetic to the cause.
It's a pretty strong suggestion that we've got something here.
So what have we discovered? James Hamlin was a black, illiterate male from Virginia, a slave state. In 1856, he embarked on a whaling voyage on the Charles W. Morgan, a ship whose owners were both anti-slavery. It's highly likely that he was a fugitive slave. and that Morgan and his partner, Samuel Rodman, risked fines or even imprisonment to help him. So we've got some news to tell Alvin about the ship he's loved since childhood.
The evidence that this rumor is true is very, very compelling.
We found references in Morgan's diary, Charles Morgan's diary, to show that he was very sympathetic to the cause of abolition. We found these records of the crew.
And in 1856, there were 3 African Americans on board.
One of them, James Hamlin, from Norfolk, Virginia, was 28 years old. We found that he was an illiterate, because when he signed on, he couldn't sign his name. All he could sign was X.
He could have been escaping slavery and using his employment on the Charles W. Morgan as a way of escaping capture.
Wonderful. Wonderful. It's good to hear.
We know life on the whaling ships was extremely hard.
That's for sure. Tough life.
It's a tough life.
Yeah.
It's a tough life. But it's very interesting that it wasn't so tough that it discouraged everybody.
It's the better of 2 evils.
This investigation has turned up a little-known episode in the story of the Underground Railroad. These wonderful whaling ships really were a route to freedom for fugitive slaves.
Well, it's quite a legacy that the Charles W. Morgan has put forth, and that your grandfather was part of that legacy in 1920, taking reins of the boat and sailing out on another whaling voyage. So this was a remarkable discovery. It's interesting, too, to note that your grandfather shipped out on the schooner Quickstep under Captain Henry Manley, Alvin's relative.
Yeah, he shipped out on the schooner Quickstep for 4 months with Captain Henry Manley.
Well, I would imagine that as you continue your research, you'll discover new information, more information that continues to fill out the picture of your grandfather's amazing life and his life as a whaling master.
You know, well, it makes me very, very proud to know that my grandfather had a good part in American history, and all the family. And everybody is so appreciative that every time we learn something, it's a new experience.
And what was his famous expression in his logbooks as he...
And so ends this day. And everyone here, I don't know if you did, but I brought a biography of his life.
It's on the table.
There's enough for everybody there. It's on the table here. Take a copy home with you. So,
Very good.
thank you for coming.
You're great.
And thank you for Richard for helping me with home.
And Dan, in appreciation for all you do for us and for today, we have this plaque for you. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very, very much. Also, I had heard today through Bud that Matthew Stockpole, which is a great, great friend of mine for years and years, and it helped me so much up at Mystic, that he could not attend today because he's giving a talk on whaling over the Martha's Vineyards. So. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed it. So.
Thank you all so much for joining us today. Safe and healthy year, and hope to see you again next year.
Thank you.
Meeting adjourned.